Have you ever heard of Anthony Arkwright? He is the youngest person in the UK to receive a whole life order. His crimes were so cruel that even after many appeals, his whole life sentence is still upheld. This is True Crime with Emma, and if you enjoy true crime, please feel free to give me a follow. I also have a podcast on Spotify. Just search for True Crime with Emma. Now let's look at the case of Anthony Arkwright. It's 1988 and Anthony's 21 years old. He lives in Wath-upon-Dearne, which is in South Yorkshire in the UK. He was the middle child of 5. His father was a coal miner and his mother Zoe left the family home when Anthony was just 4 years old. No one knows the reason behind this, but it really then affected Anthony growing up. He was passed from care home to care home and had a very disturbing childhood. Not only did he suffer from abuse in these care homes, there were also vicious rumours that he was the product of an incestuous, abusive relationship between his grandfather and mother. We now know these rumours to be completely untrue, but at the time it really impacted Anthony and he ended up rebelling. He was very disruptive at school and eventually got expelled. At a young age, he committed many petty crimes, including shoplifting, fighting, robbing. Many people tried to help him, but he was very uncooperative. He did not want help. He resisted against it. Psychiatrists even tried to help him, but again, he was unwilling. When he went to sort of juvenile detention centres, they were there evaluating him, trying to help, but he just didn't want to help and he didn't want to change. And when he did go to sort of juvenile detention centres, he found this really hard because of those inbred rumours. He would be taunted and bullied a lot in prison. As a young adult, he was a survival enthusiast. He really challenged himself to sort of live outdoors by himself. He would build shelters and stay in them overnight. If you were to look at it in nowadays society, you would think of people like Bear Grylls. He always carried a knife in his boot and various sort of equipment that he would need for survival. He had 1 or 2 friends, but he was mainly a loner. He slept in the woods. He liked to be away from everyone. He liked to just kind of do his own thing. He found it really difficult to stay in employment. He often just didn't turn up, which meant that he would eventually lose his job. So in his teenage years, his life was made up of mainly living in a council flat, doing odd jobs and losing them. He would often work down scrap yards, but he would just never turn up. He spent a lot of his time down the pub. He also had a real obsession with true crime, and he wanted to be infamous like Jack the Ripper or the Yorkshire Ripper. In August of 1988, aged 21, Anthony loses another job. He is now unemployed, so he heads to his favourite place, the pub. He begins drinking, and by 4 or 5 p.m, he decides that it's time to go visit his grandfather's house to confront him about those vicious rumours. His grandfather, Stanislav, is Lithuanian, and when he arrives at his house, his grandfather's housekeeper, Elsa, who is 73 years old, tells Anthony that Stanislav is not there. Anthony knows that his grandfather is enthusiastic about gardening and has an allotment, so figures that he must be there instead. When he arrives at the allotment, he immediately spots his grandfather, and rather than go up to him and talk to him about these vicious rumours, Anthony grabs that knife from his boot and stabs his grandfather through the neck. This attack severed his grandfather's spinal cord. Anthony then dragged his grandfather into the nearby shed, spotted an axe, grabbed it, lifted it way above his head and smashed it into his grandfather's chest. Believing that this attack still wasn't enough, Anthony spotted a lump hammer which weighed about a stone, like 14 pounds. He grabbed this lump hammer and struck Stanislav, his grandfather, in the head. After this incredibly vicious attack, he then exited the shed, locked it up, and went back to his grandfather's house. With him though, he took the axe that he found, and when he got there and was confronted by Elsa, the 73-year-old housekeeper, he once again raised this axe as high as he could and struck her in the head. After this brutal attack on a very defenceless woman, he then went around and stole £3,000 from his grandfather's house, which is believed to be Stanislav's life savings. With this money, he then decides to go out and spend it, have a night on the town. So he's out in South Yorkshire drinking with various people that he knows, and he's having a great time. He often drops very odd hints about what he's done that day. He would say things like, "It's been murder on the allotment today." But people just kind of brushed it off. Anthony was a little odd anyway. It's the early hours of Saturday morning and he is still drinking, but he ends up picking a fight with some bouncers and they get just so fed up of him, they just throw him. They literally throw him across the street and tell him to go home. So Anthony makes his way back to his flat, and next door lives Raymond Ford, who Anthony despises. They hate each other, but Anthony is more of the protagonist. He would literally post envelopes of feces through Raymond's door. He once broke into Raymond's flat and stole his microwave. Raymond reported this to the police and said that he believed it was Anthony Arkwright. So Raymond Ford is a 45-year-old man. He used to be a teacher, and in the early hours of Saturday morning, he's just sat in his armchair watching telly. So Anthony decides to break into Raymond Ford's flat. He creeps up behind him. He is completely naked, apart from wearing a kind of plastic mask, which is in the form of a devil. So he has this devil mask on. He's completely naked and he has 2 knives and he just begins stabbing Raymond. He stabs Raymond between 250 and 500 times. And these aren't shallow attacks. One knife literally broke in half due to the extreme force Anthony was using. This is a completely senseless and meaningless attack. Okay, they don't like each other, but to viciously attack someone in such a way and murder them is just cruel behaviour, and it only got worse. With his remaining knife, Anthony proceeds to remove every single organ from Raymond's body, and he begins just scattering these body parts around the flat. Once he's done, he then leaves the knife in the cavity where Raymond's stomach used to be. His inspiration for this crime is Jack the Ripper. He wanted to be just like him, and he also is infamous for disemboweling his victims. This attack and mutilation of poor Raymond Ford finishes at around 4 a.m. when Anthony returns to his flat and cleans himself up. At 7 a.m, the police knock on Anthony's door, and you would think this is to do with the 2 murders that he's just committed, but no, this is a follow-up call for Raymond's sort of complaint against him, saying that Anthony had burgled him. So Anthony goes to the police station, answers a few questions about this sort of robbery of Raymond's house. The police have no idea what had happened next door or with his grandfather. Anthony is released on bail and given a court date. They have let a man who's committed double murder walk free. They had no idea about the massacre that happened just next door to Anthony's flat. So that evening, Saturday night, Anthony decides to go drinking again, using the rest of his grandfather's life savings. Someone overheard Anthony saying that he was going to kill that bastard. That bastard being Marcus Law, who is another neighbour that Anthony had been feuding with. So Marcus Young is a 25-year-old man who has some disabilities from a motorcycle accident he'd been in when he was younger. He lives in a bungalow next to the flats. Very early hours of Sunday morning, Anthony decides to pay him a visit. He breaks into Marcus's bungalow and proceeds to stab him. He stabs him over 70 times. After stabbing him, he then placed one of the crutches that Marcus's used into Marcus's stomach. Anthony Arkwright then went on to remove Marcus Law's eyeballs. In those sockets, he placed cigarettes. He also placed cigarettes in Marcus's ears and nostrils. Anthony later stated that this was punishment for borrowing so many of my cigarettes. So for occasionally borrowing some of Anthony's cigarettes, Anthony has brutally murdered Marcus Law, a 25-year-old man. It was another horrific murder and mutilation of a young man. Anthony went back to his flat, showered, cleaned up. In the morning, he saw Marcus's mum on the way to visit Marcus. Marcus's mum, Norma, had 2 sons, but her first tragically died via suicide when he was just 13 years old. So Marcus was the only son that they had left. On the way to visit her son that morning, Anthony shouts out, "I'm sorry to hear about Marcus's suicide." Norma then rushes into Marcus's bungalow, and you can only imagine what she discovers. The police are called and Anthony is immediately arrested. When he is detained, For some reason, he is given a pack of playing cards and he begins kind of shuffling them. He then pulls out the 4 of hearts. He places it on the table and states very clearly, "This is the MasterCard. You have 4 bodies and a madman on the loose." He then tells the police that you have Marcus Law, but the 3 others are just too horrific to describe. So the police begin searching for these other victims and they end up at Raymond Ford's flat. When the policeman enters this flat, he just sees rubbish everywhere and there's also blood and glass bottles. As he's making his way through though, he suddenly realises that that's not rubbish on the floor, that's someone's insides. There are various organs just scattered everywhere, blood all up the walls. They then discover Raymond Ford's body. It's a horrific scene for anybody to come across. They then go to Anthony's grandfather's house where they discover Elsa, the 73-year-old housekeeper who has been struck with an axe to her head. There's no sign of Stanislav though, but the neighbours do tell police that he has an allotment that he loves. So they head down there and they discover the body of Anthony's grandfather. Anthony is charged with 4 counts of murder. Angry that he wasn't receiving the attention he believed he should have, he began defecating all over his cell and also telling police that there's actually a 5th victim. So police go on this hunt, trying to search for another victim, which just isn't there. He's wasting a lot of police time. Anthony is taken to a psychiatric hospital where he is assessed. The psychiatrists there say that Anthony is completely sane. In fact, they state he is the sanest person in this building and he's deemed fit to stand trial. Initially, Anthony was saying he was not guilty, but then at trial in 1989, he changes his plea to guilty. Anthony pled guilty to 3 out of the 4 murders, but he said he was not guilty for the murder of Elsa. The judge ordered that this charge be left on file. His defense was that he had serious mental illnesses, that he had a very disturbed childhood. He had a lot of personality damage and many personality disorders. Initially, he was found guilty and given a life sentence of 25 years. The judge accepted that he did have a very deprived and disturbed childhood, but this was no excuse for the utter cruelty of his crimes and the fact that he seemed to glean sadistic pleasure from these murders. 1 year later, in 1990, the case is looked at again, and this is when Anthony is given a whole life order, so he will never get out of prison. He will never have a chance at parole. At this time, he is the youngest offender ever to receive this sentence. What's really, truly sadly also about this case is that Marcus Law's father, Tony Law, ended his own life at the age of 62 by poisoning himself with car exhaust fumes. He just couldn't get over the horror of what had happened to his son. Marcus's mother, Norma, said that what happened to Marcus preyed on Tony's mind. He kept having nightmares that Marcus was screaming for his dad, but he just couldn't get to him. In 2013, the European Court of Human Rights said that whole life orders were a breach of human rights and inhumane. On this basis, Anthony tries to appeal his sentencing, but he is denied. The appeal is rejected, and they state that the issuing of a whole life order in Anthony's case was lawful. Anthony has never shown any remorse and he's never even disclosed his motive. The only thing we can glean is that he just wanted to be an infamous serial killer. That was the case of Anthony Arkwright. If you like my content, please remember to like, subscribe and comment. I do have a podcast on Spotify as well that you can go and see. If you have any suggestions, please let me know in the comments below. If you have any comments on the case, that would be great. And as always, I will see you next time.